Let me tell you something about land. Land is not just terrain. Land is power. Land is leverage. Land is the difference between a nation that survives and one that slowly bleeds out on the map. And right now, in the southern theater of this war, there is a 600-kilometer stretch of highway that may determine the outcome of one of the most consequential conflicts of the 21st century. I want you to understand what is happening on that road, because what is unfolding there is not just a military story. It is a story about the limits of empire, the cost of overreach, and the slow, grinding force of strategic patience. Stay with me until the end of this, because what Ukraine is doing to Russia's most critical supply corridor is something that military academies will study for decades, and the implications stretch far beyond Ukraine's borders. I have spent over 3 decades in uniform. I have planned missions behind enemy lines. I have sent men and women into situations where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in seconds. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the most dangerous thing you can do to an army is not to destroy it on the battlefield. The most dangerous thing you can do is cut it off, isolate it, starve it of fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcement. When you do that, an army does not collapse all at once. It unravels, slowly, then suddenly. And that is precisely what Ukraine is engineering along the M14 highway right now. The M14 is not just a road. It is the circulatory system of Russia's entire southern occupation. Every tank that moves, every missile that fires, every soldier that eats in Crimea does so because something traveled that road. Stretching 600 kilometers through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol, it is the land bridge that connects mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. Putin seized Crimea in 2014 in what looked like a brilliant strategic maneuver. Swift, decisive, and nearly bloodless. But holding Crimea is an entirely different equation. It requires a constant, uninterrupted flow of logistics. And for years, Russia believed it had secured that flow. It was wrong. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about how this war is being fought. Let me put this in terms any military commander would understand. You have 2 routes into Crimea. You have the Kerch Bridge, which spans the Strait of Kerch and connects the peninsula to Russian territory. And you have the M14 land corridor running along the northern coast of the Black Sea. The bridge has been damaged multiple times. Its capacity is limited. It is a single point of failure that every logistician in Russia's chain of command loses sleep over. The M14 was supposed to be the solution. It was supposed to be the redundant, reliable, high-capacity artery that kept the entire southern operation alive. But Ukraine has now brought significant sections of that highway under fire control using drones, which means Russia no longer has a reliable route into Crimea. It has one damaged bridge and one road that is becoming a kill zone. And when you only have one reliable lifeline left, you are one strike away from a catastrophe. Now, I want to explain what fire control actually means, because this is where the military analysis gets critically important. Fire control does not mean Ukraine has physically occupied the road. It means that Ukrainian drones can see the road, track movement on the road, and strike targets on the road with sufficient consistency to make it dangerous and operationally disruptive. Convoys cannot move freely. Timing windows must be identified and exploited. Every truck driver, every logistics officer, every commander sending a resupply convoy down that road knows they are being watched. And that psychological pressure compounds every day. I have seen what that kind of sustained threat does to the human beings responsible for keeping a force supplied. It creates hesitation. It creates errors in judgment. It creates a logistics corps that starts prioritizing its own survival over operational efficiency. And an inefficient logistics chain in modern warfare is a losing one. But here is what makes this situation even more remarkable. Ukraine did not stumble into this strategic position. It was planned, it was methodical, and the level of operational security that preceded the counteroffensives in the Zaporizhia direction is something that deserves serious attention from anyone who studies the art and science of warfare. According to reporting from independent Ukrainian journalists embedded with frontline units, Ukraine's counteroffensive in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk border region was held so tightly that within a brigade of over 2,000 soldiers, only approximately 10 individuals knew the full scope of the operation before it commenced. 10 people. Think about what that means. In an environment where every road is watched by drones, where every radio transmission can be intercepted, where every movement of heavy equipment is potentially visible to Russian reconnaissance, Ukraine maintained operational security at a level that would be considered exceptional even in a peacetime exercise. And it paid off completely. Russian forces reportedly did not realize the Ukrainian assault was underway until attacking units had already appeared behind their positions. That is not luck. That is discipline. That is the kind of mission planning that wins wars. Before the infantry even moved, Ukrainian forces spent considerable time neutralizing the Russian artillery network. Roughly 150 Russian artillery pieces were identified in a 30-kilometer stretch between Huliai-Pole and Berdyansk. Each one was targeted. Artillery fire and drone strikes worked in systematic coordination, suppressing Russian fire support before Ukrainian ground forces ever crossed the line of departure. Even the weather cooperated. Fog moved in and provided additional concealment. When conditions align with preparation, it is easy to mistake fortune for fate. But make no mistake, Ukraine's commanders created the conditions for that fog to matter. They were ready to exploit it when it came. And yet I want you to understand the price that was paid on the ground, because war is never clean, and its costs are borne by the men and women who execute the plan, not the generals who design it. After every successful counterattack, Ukrainian reinforcements sometimes had to cover 10 to 20 kilometers on foot to reach frontline positions, because vehicles were too large, too loud, and too easily targeted by Russian drone surveillance. Moving on foot, under load, across contested terrain, while drones circle overhead, is one of the most physically and psychologically demanding things a human being can be asked to do. And Ukrainian soldiers are doing it repeatedly. That is not just courage. That is the kind of sustained, grinding resilience that defines whether an army can absorb pressure and keep fighting. Ukraine's army is absorbing that pressure, and it is still advancing. Since January 2026, Ukrainian forces have recaptured approximately 65 square kilometers of territory in the Zaporizhia direction alone. The battle for Stepnohirsk, a settlement located roughly 25 kilometers south of the city of Zaporizhia, has now entered its 7th month. Russia deployed some of its most capable units to this area, including motorized infantry divisions, VDV airborne formations, and elements of the 58th Combined Arms Army. These are not second-line garrison troops. These are Russia's most experienced and battle-hardened units. And despite their presence in significant numbers, Russia has failed to gain meaningful initiative in this sector. Ukrainian forces have pushed Russian positions back in the town center and the northern sectors of Stepnohirsk. The hold, counterattack, consolidate cycle that Ukraine has refined over months of combat is neutralizing every Russian assault attempt, one by one. And the fact that Russia's elite units cannot break through tells you something fundamental about where the operational balance stands in this theater. But if you think the frontline battle is the most consequential thing happening in southern Ukraine right now, you are not seeing the full picture. Because while those ground engagements are critical, the strategic blow that could genuinely reshape this war is being struck much further back. The blow aimed not at Russia's troops, but at the very infrastructure keeping those troops alive and fighting. Ukraine has brought sections of the Taganrog-Zhankoi highway under fire control. This is not a secondary road. This is the main land artery feeding occupied Crimea. And simultaneously, on the night of May 5th into May 6th, Ukrainian drone strikes hit Russian military assets near Zhankoi in occupied Crimea. An S-400 launcher system was struck. 2 mobile fire group vehicles were destroyed. And most significantly, the Zhankoi railway station, which is Crimea's most important rail junction, was hit directly. 5 Russian soldiers were killed. 5 more were wounded. A locomotive was destroyed. Multiple freight cars were damaged. Zhankoy is not a random target. It is a central node through which nearly all railway traffic entering Crimea from the Russian mainland via the Kerch Bridge is distributed onward to Sevastopol, Simferopol, and southern coastal military installations. A damaged locomotive causes delays measured in days. A disrupted junction cascades through the entire supply network. Ukraine is not just striking the road, it is striking the destination where the road terminates. It is attacking the system at both ends simultaneously. What comes next may be the most consequential phase of this entire war. And I want to make sure you understand exactly how close Russia's position in Crimea is to becoming strategically untenable. There is a principle in military strategy that I want you to hold on to as we move into the second half of this analysis. It is called culminating point. Every offensive operation, every defensive posture, every logistical system has a culminating point. The moment at which the force can no longer sustain its current tempo. The moment at which the weight of attrition, disruption, and resource depletion tips the balance irrevocably in the other direction. I have watched armies reach that point. I have planned operations designed to accelerate the arrival of that point in an adversary. And what I am observing in southern Ukraine right now carries every hallmark of a force that is approaching its culminating point faster than its leadership is willing to admit. Russia's position along the M14 corridor and throughout occupied Crimea is not collapsing today. But the architecture of that collapse is being assembled, beam by beam, with methodical and relentless Ukrainian precision. And the window in which Russia can reverse this trajectory is narrowing with every drone strike, every disrupted convoy, and every day that the Zhankoy railway junction sits partially degraded. Let me tell you about what panic looks like inside a military bureaucracy, because I have seen it. It does not always announce itself with dramatic statements or visible disorder. Often, panic inside a large military organization looks like overreaction. It looks like rushed redeployments that weaken one sector to stabilize another. It looks like electronic warfare assets being stripped from offensive operations and redirected to convoy protection. It looks like logistics personnel who start padding their own timelines and inflating their supply requests because they no longer trust the system to deliver on schedule. And every single one of those indicators is now visible in Russia's southern theater. Russia has redeployed VDV airborne units from the Donetsk front to Zaporizhia. These are offensive shock troops being used as defensive plugs. That is not a sign of an army executing its plan. That is a sign of an army reacting to someone else's plan. And right now, that someone else is Ukraine. The ripple effects of this redeployment extend far beyond the Zaporizhia front. Russia's main offensive operation toward Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region is now being conducted with a diminished pool of its most capable assault units. The Kremlin made a deliberate choice: protect the land bridge to Crimea, even at the cost of slowing the primary offensive. That decision tells you everything about what Moscow truly values in this war. Pokrovsk is operationally significant, but Crimea is existentially significant. Losing meaningful control of the Zaporizhia corridor does not just threaten a military position, it threatens the entire political foundation upon which Putin has constructed his narrative of this war. Crimea is Putin's trophy. It is the achievement he points to when he needs to justify the cost of this conflict to a Russian public that is quietly exhausted, economically strained, and increasingly uncertain about where this road leads. If Crimea becomes visibly unsustainable, that narrative fractures. And fractured narratives and authoritarian systems are far more dangerous to their leaders than fractured front lines. Russian military bloggers, the so-called Z-bloggers, who have spent years cheerleading this war and managing public perception on behalf of the Kremlin's information apparatus, are now openly expressing alarm. Journalist Denis Kazansky captured this shift in his analysis of recent posts from Russian propagandists. These are not dissidents or critics. These are individuals deeply invested in projecting Russian strength and confidence. And they are writing about logistical paralysis, inadequate electronic warfare coverage, and the inability to intercept Ukrainian drones operating deep behind what was previously considered a secure rear area. When your own propagandists start telling your population that the rear is not safe, you have lost control of the information environment in a way that is very difficult to recover. Former militant commander Igor Girkin, whose credibility among Russian nationalist circles is significant, has stated plainly that Russia cannot keep pace with the new generation of drone warfare. That assessment is not coming from a Western analyst or a Ukrainian official. It is coming from someone who built his reputation fighting for Russian territorial expansion. When figures like Girkin start sounding alarm bells, serious people inside the Russian military establishment are listening. And what is generating that alarm is not theoretical. It is operational and it is measurable. Ukraine's Hornet drones are now operating more than 100 kilometers behind the front lines, hunting fuel tankers, striking supply convoys, and targeting strategic transportation infrastructure with a consistency that has fundamentally altered the calculus of Russian rear area operations. The T-0509 highway, which runs through Mariupol toward Donetsk, was once among the most secure logistical routes in the entire Russian-controlled territory. Ukrainian drones have now been geolocated conducting strikes along that corridor. Azov Corps footage shows Ukrainian unmanned systems patrolling roads around Mariupol, 160 kilometers behind the front lines. 160 kilometers. In previous conflicts, that depth would have represented an area of complete operational freedom for the occupying force. In this war, it is a kill zone, and Russia does not have a credible answer to the threat that is creating it. I want to pause here and address something that I think is critically important for anyone trying to understand the full strategic picture. Ukraine does not possess the kind of conventional air power that NATO would deploy to execute a deep interdiction campaign against an adversary's supply lines. It does not have squadrons of strike aircraft flying around-the-clock sorties to cut rail lines, destroy fuel depots, and crater highway intersections the way the coalition did in the Gulf War or Allied forces did in the final campaigns of World War II. What Ukraine has done instead is something arguably more innovative and more sustainable. It has built a distributed, low-cost, high-volume drone interdiction capability that achieves comparable effects at a fraction of the cost and without exposing manned aircraft to Russian air defenses. When a Ukrainian drone costing a few $1,000s destroys a Russian fuel tanker, a radar installation, or a locomotive at a critical rail junction, the cost-exchange ratio is so asymmetric that it becomes mathematically unsustainable for Russia to absorb over time. Ukraine is imposing costs measured in millions. It is paying costs measured in thousands. That asymmetry, sustained over months and years, is how you strangle a military machine without matching it tank for tank or missile for missile. The strikes on Russian air defense infrastructure deserve particular attention here because they represent a systematic effort to degrade the protective umbrella that shields everything else. Ukrainian unmanned systems forces conducted precision strikes in early May targeting Pantsir and Tor air defense systems, PRV-16 and P-18 radar stations, fuel and lubricant depots, ammunition storage facilities, and temporary troop deployment sites across the occupied Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk regions. Each of those target categories serves a specific function in Russia's war machine. Radars provide situational awareness. Air defense systems protect personnel and equipment. Fuel moves everything. Ammunition enables fires. Deployment sites allow rotation and offensive preparation. Ukraine is not randomly striking targets of opportunity. It is systematically dismantling the interlocking systems that allow Russia to sustain combat power in the south. And when those systems begin to fail simultaneously, the degradation is not additive. It is exponential. But what happens next will demonstrate just how far Ukraine's reach has truly extended. The announcement that Ukrainian drones struck Su-57 and Su-34 aircraft at the Shagol airfield near Chelyabinsk sent a message that transcended the immediate tactical significance of the strike itself. Chelyabinsk is approximately 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. 1,700 kilometers. In strategic terms, that is not a strike on a forward deployed asset. That is a strike into the heart of Russia's strategic depth. And a Kilo-class missile submarine capable of launching Caliber cruise missiles was struck at the port of Primorsk. Distance no longer provides the safety it once did. Russia's commanders can no longer look at a map and draw a circle beyond which they consider their assets secure. That circle no longer exists. Every airfield, every port, every fuel depot, every logistics hub on Russian-controlled territory now exists within the potential operational range of Ukrainian unmanned systems. And that reality fundamentally changes how Russia must allocate its air defense resources, its security forces, and its operational planning assumptions. Now, I want to speak directly to Putin's recent rhetorical shift because it matters and because it should not be mistaken for what it is not. Putin has begun making statements suggesting the war is approaching its conclusion. He has adjusted his public posture in ways that some observers have interpreted as signals of genuine willingness to negotiate. Do not be deceived by that. Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov made the actual Russian position clear when he stated that progress in any peace process would stall unless Ukraine withdrew from the Donbass. Let me translate that for you plainly. Russia is demanding through diplomatic language territory it has not fully seized through military force. It is attempting to achieve through negotiation what it has been unable to achieve through combat. That is not a peace offer. That is an attempt to convert battlefield stalemate into political victory. And the reason Putin is making that attempt right now is precisely because the battlefield is not delivering the results he needs. Slowing momentum, rising casualties, deep strike capability reaching into Russian territory, and now a land bridge to Crimea that is under sustained and escalating pressure. These are not the conditions under which a dominant power dictates terms. These are the conditions under which a struggling power seeks an exit that preserves the appearance of achievement. Retired General Ben Hodges, one of the most astute observers of this conflict, has been advocating for a three-phase strategic model for months. Phase one is isolation, severing the logistical lifelines that sustain Russian military presence in Crimea. Phase two is making the situation untenable, raising the cost of occupation beyond what Russia can absorb economically and militarily. Phase three is liberation, the eventual collapse of Russian control on the peninsula without the need for a catastrophically costly direct ground assault. In April 2026, Hodges stated with characteristic directness that there is no need for a frontal assault on Crimea. Cut off the logistics and let time take care of the rest. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War and the Atlantic Council have consistently reinforced this assessment. A direct assault on Crimea carries unacceptable risks, including the possibility of nuclear escalation as Russia's red lines are approached. But logistical isolation is a slow, patient, economically devastating pressure that does not trigger those same escalatory dynamics. It simply makes holding Crimea more expensive every single week until the cost becomes politically and militarily unbearable. Ukraine is now executing phase one of that model with visible and measurable effect. The M14 is under fire control. The T-0509 is under drone surveillance. The Jankoy railway junction has been struck. The Kerch Bridge stands as the last nominally intact route, and it is a single point of failure that Ukraine has explicitly stated it intends to address when the operational conditions are right. Russia's southern position is not surrounded. It is not overrun, but it is being systematically constricted. And constriction, applied with patience and precision, is often more decisive than the most dramatic battlefield assault. There is an economic dimension to this pressure that I want you to fully appreciate, because wars are ultimately decided not just on the battlefield, but in the ledger books of national sustainment. Maintaining Russian military presence in Crimea is extraordinarily expensive. Air defense networks, naval forces, ground troops, infrastructure maintenance, and now the added cost of convoy protection, alternative routing, equipment repair, and electronic warfare deployment. Every drone strike Ukraine conducts forces Russia to spend money it increasingly cannot afford. Every damaged locomotive, every destroyed fuel tanker, every degraded radar system must be replaced or repaired at cost. Ukraine is achieving these effects with drones that cost a few $1,000s each. The asymmetry is not just military, it is economic. And an economy under the strain of sanctions, reduced energy revenue, wartime inflation, and demographic pressure from casualties and immigration cannot indefinitely absorb that kind of asymmetric cost imposition. The 800,000 Russian civilians who have settled in Crimea since 2014 are living with a growing awareness that the security guarantees they were implicitly offered when they relocated are eroding. Air defense systems are being struck. Railway junctions are being hit. Supply routes are becoming dangerous. The psychological impact of that shift cannot be underestimated in a society where the narrative of invincibility and control is central to political stability. When ordinary people start asking whether the peninsula is truly secure, when propagandists start publicly worrying about logistics paralysis, and when elite military units are being pulled from offensive operations to plug defensive gaps in a corridor that was supposed to be fully under Russian control, the question is no longer whether Crimea can be reclaimed. The question is how much longer Russia can sustain the pretense that holding it is cost-free. I spent my career studying what breaks armies and what sustains them. I have watched the most powerful military organizations in the world face the moment when the weight of what they are being asked to do exceeds the resources and the will available to do it. That moment has a feeling. It has indicators. And the indicators I see emerging from Russia's southern theater carry the unmistakable signature of a force approaching its operational and strategic limit. This is not the end of this war. Wars do not end neatly or quickly. But this is a turning point in a specific and critical axis of the conflict. And what Ukraine is doing along the Zaporizhia-Crimea corridor, with discipline, patience, operational creativity, and a willingness to absorb extraordinary hardship in service of a strategic objective, is a masterclass in how a smaller force defeats a larger one. Not by matching it in mass, but by making its position unsustainable. One road at a time, one bridge at a time, one railway junction at a time. Putin seized Crimea in days. Ukraine intends to make holding it cost him everything. And based on everything we are seeing on the ground right now, that strategy is working.